A black waitress warns a white client that someone spit in his food, and from that moment, chaos is unleashed. If you love real, emotional stories, follow us, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. The dining room shimmered with velvet curtains, candlelit tables, and the low hum of Charleston's elite. Every glass, every gesture, every laugh felt rehearsed, as though the restaurant itself was a stage. At a small table near the kitchen doors sat a man in a plain jacket, unnoticed among the pearls and tailored suits. He raised his fork, about to taste the most expensive cut on the menu, a dish meant to impress, not to nourish. And then it happened. A folded linen napkin slid beneath the edge of his plate. It didn't belong there. He unfolded it, and the words, written in rushed, uneven ink, cut through the air like a blade. They spit in your food. This place is not safe. The fork froze mid-air. His breath caught. Around him, the music played on, wine poured, and laughter sparkled in the air. But inside him, time stopped. That warning was no accident. It was a spark, and it was about to set the whole house on fire. He wasn't just another diner. The man at the corner table had a secret no one in that room could guess. His name was Richard Hale, a wealthy investor from Boston, the kind of man whose signature could change the future of an entire company. But tonight, he wanted no recognition. He came to Charleston quietly, without assistants, without drivers, without the polished armor of wealth. Just an old jacket, worn shoes, and the determination to see this restaurant for what it really was. Not the glossy photos on its website, not the glamorous reviews in glossy magazines, but the truth hidden behind velvet curtains and smiling hosts. Richard believed in something dangerous for a man like him. He believed in disappearing. Because only when you're invisible do people reveal who they really are. So, when he stepped through the grand entrance of the Cradle, no one saw a man who controlled millions. They saw only a stranger, underdressed, out of place, someone who didn't belong. And that was exactly what he wanted. The hostess's smile faltered when she noticed his simple clothes. The manager's eyes slid past him as if he were invisible. The other guests never looked up from their wine glasses. And yet, Richard was watching everything. He noticed the glances, the whispers, the way the staff divided their energy between the powerful and the forgotten. Every detail told him a story, and he was very good at reading stories others wanted to hide. But what Richard didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine, was that someone else was also watching. Someone who had lived the truth of this place far longer than he had. A waitress. A young black woman named Naomi Brooks. And on this night, their two worlds were about to collide, with nothing more than a napkin to set it all in motion. The Cradle wasn't just a restaurant. It was a stage. Every chandelier dripped with polished crystal, every velvet curtain whispered of old money, and every polished floor seemed to say, "You're lucky to even be here." The locals called it a jewel of Charleston, the cradle of Southern elegance, a place where senators and CEOs reserved their favorite tables months in advance. The website boasted history and tradition, photos of smiling guests under golden light. But beneath the sheen of sophistication, something darker lingered. The portraits on the walls told the real story. Paintings of Confederate generals, unmarked and unlabeled, gazed down at the dining room as if the past itself were still watching, still in control. To most guests, they were decorations, heritage, they'd say. But to Richard, sitting quietly at his corner table, the message was clear. This was not just a restaurant. It was a monument to who belonged and who didn't. The staff moved with rehearsed precision. White waiters in pressed shirts glided from table to table, pouring wine, laughing at jokes that weren't funny, calling guests sir and madam with exaggerated reverence. Their smiles stretched wider whenever a Rolex glinted in the candlelight or a country club membership card slipped from a wallet. And then there were the others, the ones who carried the weight but never the spotlight. Black and brown workers confined to the kitchen, the dish pit, the back hallways. Unseen, unheard. Except for one. Naomi Brooks. The only black waitress allowed on the floor. She carried herself with quiet grace, but Richard noticed her eyes. They weren't the eyes of someone lost in routine. They were sharp, alive, recording everything. She moved like a shadow, careful not to draw attention, yet impossible to ignore once you truly looked. Richard watched as she served the back tables, always the least desirable assignments, always the ones no one else wanted. He noticed how other servers cut in front of her, how the manager brushed past her as if she were invisible. And Naomi noticed him, too. Not because he was loud or demanding, he wasn't. He was the opposite. Silent. Observant. Sitting in clothes that didn't fit the room, but with a stillness that felt intentional, powerful. Unlike anyone else, he looked her in the eyes when she approached. He didn't look through her. He looked at her. In that brief moment, Naomi felt something shift. For once, someone saw her not as a server, not as an inconvenience, but as a person. And that was dangerous. Because Naomi carried a truth inside her, a truth heavy as stone, and tonight it was pressing against her ribs, begging to break free. She didn't yet know if she would risk everything to say it. But she knew this: the cradle wasn't just broken. It was built to exclude. And sooner or later, someone had to expose it. Her name was Naomi Brooks. At first glance, she was just another waitress moving quietly between tables, balancing trays of wine and plates too heavy for her wrists. But Naomi carried an entire world in her silence, a world of broken dreams, unspoken battles, and a courage she wasn't sure she still had. She hadn't always worn this uniform. Not long ago, Naomi walked the halls of Howard University with her head held high, books pressed to her chest, her mind set on becoming a civil rights attorney. She believed in justice the way some people believe in gravity: invisible, unstoppable, inevitable. She believed she could fight for the voiceless. And then came the diagnosis. Her mother's cancer stripped away more than health. It devoured time, money, and the thin margin Naomi had to survive. Tuition bills stacked up like bricks on her shoulders, scholarships weren't enough, and the dream she carried since childhood was put on pause. She packed her life into a single suitcase and came home to Charleston. The Cradle was the only place that hired her. The pay was steady enough to keep the lights on, but the air inside was heavy, heavier than the trays she carried. Naomi was the only black waitress on staff, a fact never stated but always enforced. She was given the worst shifts, the least desirable sections, and the kind of customers who snapped fingers instead of using names. And when something went wrong, it was always her fault. She wore a smile like armor. "Yes, sir. Of course, ma'am." But beneath that smile, she kept count. She remembered the jokes the chef made when serving black customers. She remembered the times her colleagues laughed when she was shorted tips. She remembered the look in the manager's eyes when he dismissed her complaints without even pretending to care. Naomi wasn't weak. She was observant. She had learned long ago that survival wasn't about being the loudest in the room, it was about waiting for the right moment to speak. And tonight, something felt different. Because tonight, at table 14, sat a man who didn't quite belong either. He wasn't dressed like the others. No Rolex, no tailored suit. And yet, when Naomi approached, he didn't look through her the way most guests did. He looked directly at her. Steady, calm, as if he really saw her. For a moment, that connection was enough to shake the walls she had built around herself. Naomi had carried silence for too long. But silence can only hold so much before it breaks. And tonight, with one act in the kitchen, that silence was about to shatter. The air in the dining room felt heavier when the man at table 14 spoke. His voice was calm, steady, but his request sent a ripple through the staff. "I'll have the presidential prime," he said. Heads turned. It wasn't just a steak. It was the showpiece of the Cradle, 48 ounces of Wagyu, aged to perfection, smoked under a glass dome, unveiled at the table like a magician's trick. A plate built for spectacle, and priced at $700. It was the kind of order that usually came from hedge fund managers, politicians, people who wore their wealth like armor. Not from a man in an old jacket, sitting near the kitchen doors, alone. Naomi froze for half a second, pen hovering above her order pad. Across the room, she could already feel the manager's eyes drilling into her back. "Did he really just order that?" one of the servers whispered. The manager, Mr. Clay, folded his arms and gave her a look sharp enough to cut glass. "Make sure he pays first," he mouthed. It was an unspoken rule at the Cradle. If someone looked out of place and ordered something extravagant, the staff demanded a credit card up front. No exceptions. It was policy. But everyone knew the truth. It was about appearances, about who the restaurant decided was trustworthy and who wasn't. Naomi's stomach tightened. She knew what she was supposed to do. She was supposed to walk back, smile, and say, "I'll need a card before we send this to the kitchen, sir." And if she didn't, she'd be held responsible. She looked at the man again. He wasn't nervous. He didn't shift in his chair or avoid her gaze. He simply waited, calm, as though none of this theater mattered to him. Her hand trembled slightly as she entered the order into the POS system. The screen blinked red. Manager approval required. She hesitated. Then, with one decisive tap, she overrode the warning and sent it through under her own ID. The risk was hers now. $700 worth of risk. Behind her, Mr. Clay's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Did he pay up front?" Naomi swallowed hard, turned, and lied without flinching. "Yes, sir. Already taken care of." Clay narrowed his eyes, but said nothing more. For now. Naomi's heart pounded. She didn't know why she had done it. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was that fleeting moment when the man looked at her and truly saw her. But she knew one thing. Tonight, something was about to break. And it would start in the kitchen. The double doors swung open, and Naomi stepped into the place where the Cradle's mask came off. The dining room was polished, silent, glowing with chandeliers. But the kitchen was chaos. Heat blasted from the grills, pans clattered, voices barked orders and insults in equal measure. The air smelled of smoke, sweat, and something harsher, arrogance. Naomi slid the order ticket across the counter. "Presidential prime," she said, her voice steady though her heart thudded in her chest. The room went quiet for a beat. Heads turned. The chef, Rick, a man whose temper was as famous as his steak, smirked without looking up from the sizzling pan. "Who ordered that?" "The guy in the hoodie." A ripple of laughter broke out. The sous chef, Sue, rolled her eyes. "Does he even know how much it costs?" Naomi bit her tongue. She'd learned long ago that speaking up only made things worse. But then came the moment she would never forget. Rick leaned over the marbled slab of Wagyu, juices hissing under the sear. And with a twisted grin, he spat. Right on the meat. Time slowed. Naomi froze where she stood, her tray trembling in her hands. For a second she thought maybe she'd imagined it, maybe it was an accident, but no. Rick flipped the steak casually, like this was routine. Beside him, Sue laughed, low and cruel. "Special seasoning," Rick muttered. More laughter. Naomi's breath caught in her throat. Rage boiled beneath her skin, hot and sharp. This wasn't just a prank. It wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. A performance meant to humiliate, to degrade, to remind anyone who didn't belong that they could never truly sit at the table. And for Naomi, it was the breaking point. She had swallowed insults, endured double shifts, survived on silence. But now the silence felt like poison. She looked through the narrow window in the swinging doors, out into the dining room. There he was, the man at table 14, sitting calm, watchful, unknowingly waiting for a meal that had already been defiled. Her pulse hammered. She had seconds to decide. Serve the plate and stay safe, or risk everything. Her job, her paycheck, her last fragile bit of security, to tell the truth. Her hand moved on instinct. She reached into her apron for the pen she always carried, grabbed a fresh linen napkin from the service line, and began to write. The ink jumped across the fabric, letters uneven, trembling but fierce. "They spit in your food. This place is not safe." No name. No signature. Just the truth. She folded it quickly, pressing it tight in her palm. When the server bell dinged and the dome-covered steak was placed in her hands, she balanced the weight of silver and glass in one hand, and the weight of her own future in the other. As she pushed through the doors back into the golden glow of the dining room, Naomi knew there was no going back. Her silence had ended. The dining room sparkled as though nothing could pierce its elegance. Wine poured into crystal glasses, laughter rolled like polished marbles across the tables, and the pianist in the corner played something soft and forgettable. It was a picture-perfect evening, at least for those who believed in appearances. Naomi walked slowly, carefully, carrying the dome-covered plate as if it weighed far more than its $700. Her breath was shallow, her palms slick with sweat, her pulse racing loud enough that she wondered if anyone else could hear it. The folded napkin burned in her fist. She reached table 14. The man looked up at her with calm, steady eyes. For the briefest second, she faltered, should she really do this? But then she remembered Rick's smirk, Sue's laughter, the spit sizzling into the meat. And she knew, if she stayed silent, she would be complicit. With practiced grace, she placed the plate before him. Her right hand lifted the silver dome with the elegance drilled into her by endless shifts. Her left hand slid the folded napkin beneath the edge of his bread plate. "Enjoy your meal, sir," she said softly. Her voice didn't shake, but her heart did. Then she turned, walked away, and forced herself not to look back. Richard sat still. He hadn't touched the steak. He hadn't lifted his knife. Something in Naomi's eyes, the faintest tremor in her breath, had already warned him. Wait. Slowly, deliberately, he slid the napkin into his palm. His fingers unfolded it, and the words revealed themselves like a fuse catching flame. "They spit in your food. This place is not safe." He stared at the ink, uneven, rushed, desperate. And in that moment, the air around him changed. The chandeliers still glowed. The pianist still played. But Richard no longer saw elegance. He saw rot behind gold. He saw poison behind polish. It wasn't the spit that struck him most. He had lived through worse in boardrooms, survived betrayals measured in millions. No, it was the last line that stopped his breath. This place is not safe. This wasn't about a steak. It wasn't about one chef's cruelty. It was systemic, woven into the fabric of the Cradle like the laces of its velvet curtains. The entire place was built on exclusion, on humiliation dressed as tradition. Richard folded the napkin once more, slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket, and pushed the untouched plate aside. His face betrayed nothing. He didn't call for the manager. He didn't raise his voice. But inside, the decision was made. The facade had cracked, and nothing in this room would ever look the same again. Richard rose slowly from his chair, leaving the untouched steak behind. To the other diners, it might have looked like nothing more than a man excusing himself. A quiet trip to the restroom, perhaps. But every step he took was deliberate, measured, the silence of a storm gathering before it breaks. Across the room, Mr. Clay, the manager, noticed. He straightened his posture, smoothed his tie, and plastered on the kind of smile that had been rehearsed 1,000 times. A smile that meant nothing. "Is everything all right, sir?" Clay asked, his tone dripping with forced warmth. Richard's eyes met his. Calm, cold. "I'd like to speak with you privately," he said. Clay hesitated for the briefest moment, then gestured toward a narrow corridor lined with framed certificates and glossy photos of past events. The walls screamed credibility, yet to Richard they looked like props, shields for a rotten core. Inside the cramped office, the air was heavier. Richard didn't sit. He remained standing, his presence filling the space in a way that unsettled Clay more than he would admit. The manager began his performance. "At the Cradle, we pride ourselves on excellence. Our guests deserve nothing less than perfection. If something about your meal—" "Enough," Richard cut him off. His voice was low, sharp, and final. It sliced through the air like a blade. Clay blinked, thrown off script. I beg your pardon. I'd like to see the footage from your kitchen," Richard said. "Now." Clay's smile faltered. "Oh well, sir, those cameras are mostly for inventory and back-of-house logistics. They're not really." "Don't lie to me." Richard's tone hardened. "You heard me. Tonight. The moment my steak was prepared." The manager's throat bobbed as he swallowed. He tried again. "I'd need approval for that. And sometimes the feeds loop, you see, storage issues." "I'm not sure." Richard stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. The mask he had worn all evening, the quiet, unassuming stranger, fell away. What remained was something far more formidable. "You have one chance to be the man who helped uncover a problem," Richard said, his words deliberate, each one weighted with authority. "Or you'll be remembered as the man who buried it." Clay's mouth went dry. He stammered. "Who exactly are you?" Richard leaned in, just enough for his words to drop like iron into the silence. "I am the man who signs your checks." The color drained from Clay's face. His practiced smile collapsed. In its place came panic. His hands fumbled for the cabinet keys, his composure gone. For years, Clay had believed the Cradle was untouchable, a fortress of privilege and appearances. But in that office, with Richard Hale standing in front of him, the fortress was crumbling brick by brick. And Richard wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. The old cabinet groaned as Clay wrestled with the lock. His hands shook, betraying the fear he tried to hide behind shallow breaths. He finally pulled out a dust-covered hard drive, plugged it into the monitor, and prayed silently that whatever gaps or loops the system produced would be enough to bury the truth. Richard stood motionless, arms crossed, watching him. His silence was heavier than shouting, heavier than threats. It was the silence of someone who already knew. The screen flickered to life. Grainy footage filled the monitor. Cooks moving quickly, flames rising from pans, plates being assembled. At first, it looked ordinary, almost harmless. Then came the cut. A sharp skip in the footage, 2 minutes gone in a blink. Clay tried to speak. "Sometimes the files corrupt. It's a..." "Stop." Richard's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Play it again." Clay obeyed, rewinding, replaying, hoping the glitch would pass unnoticed. But Richard wasn't fooled. He leaned closer, his eyes scanning the timeline, and then he saw it, a backup folder, buried deep in the system. "Open that," Richard ordered. Clay froze. His palms began to sweat. He stammered, That's not for now." With trembling fingers, Clay clicked. The footage shifted. This time, there were no skips, no cuts. The truth stared back in crystal clarity. Chef Rick leaned over the marbled wagyu, lips curling into a smirk. He spat. Clear, deliberate. Sue, the sous chef, laughed and nodded. Their words, faint but audible. "That's what you get for acting like you belong here." Richard's jaw tightened, but his face remained calm, controlled, a mask forged in boardrooms and battlefields of power. Inside, though, something colder stirred. Not rage. Not shock. Clarity. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't one bad apple. It was a culture. A sickness hidden under chandeliers and velvet. Richard reached into his jacket, pulled out his old phone, and sent a single encrypted message to his security team in New York. Confirmed. Pull all backups. Secure every file. Quietly. Now. Within minutes, the footage was duplicated, encrypted, preserved beyond Clay's reach. The truth could no longer be erased. Richard turned back to the manager, whose face had gone pale. "You're finished here," he said quietly. "You just don't know how bad it is yet." Outside the office door, the restaurant carried on like nothing had happened. Forks clinked. Laughter rose. Wine flowed. But inside that cramped room, everything had changed. The Cradle wasn't just exposed. It was condemned. And in the center of it all stood Richard Hale, holding not just evidence, but a decision that would decide the fate of everyone inside these walls. The morning after felt different. The Cradle's doors were still closed, but the whispers of what had happened were already spreading through Charleston like wildfire. Inside, the chandeliers still glowed, the velvet curtains still hung, but the illusion was gone. It was no longer a temple of elegance. It was a crime scene draped in silk. Naomi arrived early, her heart pounding. Every step toward the back door felt heavier, like she was walking into her own trial. She expected scolding, punishment, dismissal, maybe even security waiting with her last paycheck in hand. But when she was summoned to the office, it wasn't Clay who waited. It was Richard. Still in his plain jacket, still carrying the same quiet authority, but this time he wasn't sitting. He was standing, as if the weight of the entire building rested on his shoulders. "Naomi Brooks," he said. Her throat tightened. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I shouldn't have." Richard raised his hand, silencing her. "You should have," he replied. "And you did." Naomi's chest ached, tears threatening at the edges of her eyes. "So, am I fired?" Richard shook his head. "Not by me." His voice softened, though his gaze stayed firm. "I own this place. And I saw everything." The words stunned her. She felt her knees weaken, the ground slipping beneath her. The man at table 14, the one she thought was just another stranger, was the one person who had the power to change everything. "I could close the Cradle today," Richard continued. "Tear it down brick by brick. Fire everyone. Start fresh. And maybe I will. But before I decide, I need to know one thing." Naomi looked up, her voice trembling. "What? Do you want to leave?" he asked. "Or do you want to stay and help me rebuild this from the inside?" Silence filled the room. The question weighed more than any she'd ever faced. Leave with dignity, maybe a scholarship or support for school. Or stay, risk the whispers, the stares, the battles, and try to turn a poisoned place into something new. Her answer came not from fear, but from the fire that had carried her through every double shift, every insult swallowed, every night she thought she couldn't keep going. "I'll stay," she said, her voice steady. Richard nodded. "Then you're not a waitress anymore. You're the new director of ethics and culture. And together, we'll make sure this place serves more than food. It will serve truth." 2 weeks later, the Cradle reopened. But it wasn't the same. The portraits of Confederate generals were gone, replaced with images of black chefs, artists, and community leaders who had shaped Charleston's true history. Staff diversity was no longer an afterthought, it was the foundation. Anonymous reporting systems were installed, training on bias became mandatory, and Naomi led every meeting with quiet authority. At the grand reopening, Richard stood before the cameras, the press swarming. Beside him, Naomi wore a navy blouse and trousers that felt far too formal for her, but she stood tall, unshaken. Richard's words were simple, but they carried weight. This woman showed more courage in one night than most executives show in a lifetime. She is the reason this truth came out. And she is the reason this place has a future. The crowd applauded, not polite applause, but real, raw, earned. Naomi felt her throat tighten, but this time she didn't hide. She let the moment wash over her, not as a victim, but as a leader. Because in the end, it wasn't Richard's money or his power that saved the Cradle. It was her. A young black woman with nothing but a napkin and the courage to write the truth. And sometimes, that's all it takes to burn down a lie and light the way toward something better.